I think we're recording now. So welcome everyone. So on behalf of myself and my co-organizers, Dorina and To, I would like to wish you, first of all, a Happy New Year. All the best for 2024 and hopefully with a lot of interesting new DIGA webinars. It's my pleasure today to introduce Sandeep Shipuri from the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. So he can kick off this new webinar series this year. So Sandeep did his master's, PhD, and a couple of years of postdoc at the Delft University of Technology. We actually had the pleasure of having Sandeep in our group, so it was a really great time. Sandeep also held positions at Robert Bosch and the Holst Center, IMEC, in the Netherlands. Robert Bosch was in India. And as I mentioned, so currently he's assistant professor at IISc in Bangalore in India. So there are some people that say that they don't hear me, but I guess the audio is fine, no? Yeah, okay.
For me, it's good. Yeah.
Okay. So Sandeep also received several awards, like the Pratiksha Trust Young Investigator Award, also some Best Conference Paper Awards, including ICASP, Silomar, and USIPCO, so very impressive. He's also an elected member of several technical committees, like the SAMTC and the SPTMTC from the IEEE Signal Processing Society. And he's also an associate editor of the IEEE Signal Processing Letters. His expertise is in the general field of signal processing with some focus on graph signal processing and network science, machine learning, and that's also the focus of his talk today. So very happy to have you here, Sandeep. So take it away. Go ahead.
Thank you. And yeah, indeed, very happy New Year to all of you. Wish you and your family all the very best in 2024. Also very happy to kick off this year's webinar series, and also happy to see that since pandemic, this has been, I guess, one of the only webinars that has sustained out of many that were kicked off. So congratulations, Hirth and team, for that. So in today's talk, what I'll try to do is I'll try to connect simplicial neural networks and see that as a generalization of graph neural networks, and in particular present simpler models, lighter models that are constant, that have constant training time and memory requirements. These are simpler models, but they are probably powerful in terms of their expressive power. So whenever we talk about any graph neural network or simplicial neural networks, the power is often measured in terms of the Weisfeiler-Lehman test. So I will present the Weisfeiler-Lehman test and then its generalization, which is the simplicial Weisfeiler-Lehman test, and connect these simpler models in terms of the power that they can achieve in terms of the Weisfeiler-Lehman test. And also I will present some experimental results. So that's basically the plan for today, and that's also what the title indicates: simple yet powerful, simpler in terms of the model, powerful in terms of the expressiveness. And these models, to make it simpler, we need to do some algebraic tricks, and that is the main contribution of these works. I would like to thank at the outset my students, Siddhant and Shravanti, who not only made these nice set of slides, but played an important role in getting these results out. So needless to introduce what graphs are to this audience, but to start my set up the context and start my talk, I will do that. So graphs are very important data structures that you can encounter in many places, and that can be used to model several data sets that we would see and several phenomena that we would see. For example, if you look at transportation networks, it could be rail networks or road networks. You would see intersections or stops. And then there are routes which these vehicle or trains would take, and those form the interactions between these stops. And these networks would also have attributes along with that in terms of what could be the flow of the traffic, or what could be the number of vehicles crossing the intersection. And one potential task that one could think of is to predict the expected time of arrival from, say, point A to point B. Similarly, you would want to predict the fastest route given the attributes. This could be data independent algorithms, only focusing on graph algorithms, but those are graph structured data. In social networks or commodity networks, you again find graphs where you would model interactions between entities. And you could use these entities to predict, for instance, if there is a community being formed, or if there is a friend recommendation, or if there is a commodity recommendation. So one could basically process these graph structured data, which will not only have graphs, which are set of nodes and edges, and you can also use the data that is available next to the graph structure itself to process that data. Again, in brain networks, you could model the human brain or any other brain of a mammal using tessellate the brain and model that as a graph. And then there are often measurements also that we take related to brain. For example, it could be EEG or it could be fMRI. And there is a data associated to each of these voxels or nodes, and these can be used to predict early onset of Alzheimer's, or predict brain age, or to classify healthy and unhealthy subjects. Another application where you would encounter graphs are biological networks, where what you would see here is an interaction network of genes, drugs, and proteins. And these could be used for predicting interactions of drug interaction, or for drug repurposing. I will revisit this particular data set in some time when I talk about link prediction associated to this particular problem. So in a nutshell, graph is a data structure that models the interactions between set of entities, that is nodes, and the interactions are usually limited to pairwise interactions. And what is interesting for us to process this data is to have a representation of this graph. When I say representation, it is a low-dimensional representation, particularly because there are 100 different ways to represent this graph. There is no ordering. If you look at time domain, there is a clear ordered underlying domain. But when you look at graphs, there are no such order. So you can think of many different ways to represent a graph. So you can think of an adjacency list, for instance. And there is also data associated to that. So you get a graph, you can represent it as a matrix. And then you also have a matrix that would be attributes of, for example, nodes or edges. And now we would like to pass this through a black box to obtain a representation of this graph. It could be the representation of the entire graph, or the underlying entities, which could be representations of nodes, for instance, in some embedding space. So you can have embedding space for nodes, embedding space for edges, but the embeddings that we obtain should be graph aware, right? So you don't simply process these attributes as tabular data, for example, using a multi-layer perceptron. You would also get a low-dimensional representation, but you will not be taking into account the graph structure. So now what we would like to do is, in graph representation learning, you would like to process this tabular data, which is a data matrix associated with each of these nodes. So if you have n nodes, you would get a data matrix with n columns. And if the initial feature dimension is, say, d, so you have a data matrix which is n times d. Now, for each of these n nodes, you would like to get a lower dimensional representation, say in a little rd space, r little d space, and you would like to represent each of these nodes using vectors. And These vectors, for instance, could be used for a downstream machine learning task. So you can again have representations for edges, taking into account whether if there are edge attributes, you would like to have representations of the vectors, and these representations could be in the same embedding space, same vector space, or it could be a different vector space. And graph representation learning as such is not a new topic. It's probably a few decades old. And there are different ways, starting from traditional algebraic ways to current day neural network or neural models to arrive at these representations. And these representations can be used for downstream machine learning tasks. For example, here the representations are of nodes indicated by different color codes, and the color indicates similarity in some sense of these nodes. Now, if you want to do node classification, for instance, you would expect that the representations that you get are of these green nodes are closer in the embedding space, and then of the blue nodes are closer in the embedding space. And now you could simply think of a linear classifier, a decoder that would classify these nodes. So similarly, if you want like to predict if there is a link between the two nodes, that's a link prediction task, then you could basically send a query with these embeddings to a decoder that would be a link predictor, and that would give you, say, a positive or a negative response to that query to see whether there is a link or not. So that is what that is what we are interested in graph representation learning. And in particular for this talk, I will rely on neural models, and in particular graph neural networks, to arrive at these embeddings. So when we talk about downstream machine learning tasks with graphs, one can think of these three problems that we see here, but most of the graph learning tasks could be modeled as one of these three tasks. So link prediction, as the name indicates, if you have a network, you would like to predict if there is a link. So this can be done in a semi-supervised setting, or you can also think of self-supervised learning techniques where you don't have labels. So in a semi-supervised learning task, there are some labels, which means that you already know that a few nodes are connected, and you would like to learn that using a neural model. And then when we query two different nodes, you would like to predict whether there is a link between these two nodes. So you would, with some probability, guess whether there is a link between two nodes or not. So that's link prediction. And node classification, like we saw in the previous example, it's basically to color different nodes into different buckets or classes. And again, this could be based on an unsupervised setting or a semi-supervised setting. In a semi-supervised setting, you have labels. So in this case, it's a multi-class classification where there are three classes, class 1 to 3. And we don't have labels for these nodes, and we would like to predict. So now in order to do that, if you have representations for each of these nodes through any of the graph representation learning mechanism, you could pass that through a decoder to obtain the colors or the labels for these nodes. The other popular task within machine learning with graphs is graph classification. So here in link prediction and node classification, we are only dealing with a single graph. And if there are labels for each of these nodes, or there are labels about the edges. So in graph classification, you would, as examples, you would see many graphs, and each graph itself has a label. So which means that now when we are doing representation learning, I would like to get one vector for the entire graph in an embedding space. So that could be, for instance, by pooling all the embeddings of the nodes that we get, or pooling all the embeddings of the nodes and edges that we get. Pooling means it could be simply a summation or some aggregator function that would give me one vector taking all the n vectors in the embedding space. And then you would use that to now label the test data or the new instance, right? So that's the label or the supervision is in the form of the labels that you have in the training data. You would get representations for each of these graphs. And whenever there is a new instance that you would query. Again, you would parse that through the representation learning black box that you have to get a vector representation. And then depending upon some decoder, which would measure discrepancy with the existing data points, you would predict a label. So in order to solve any one of these tasks or all of these tasks, graph neural networks are very popular and useful and are emerging. There are many different neural models, graph neural models, to achieve or to learn the representations. Of course, as one can imagine, graphs are limited to representing pairwise relationships between data sets. And often one could encounter data sets where the interaction is not limited to pairs of nodes, but there could be higher order interactions. Higher order interactions would mean that, for example, if we think of a social network, why would one limit the interaction between two entities, in this case, users, to a tuple, but why not have an interaction between a group? So that is what we mean by higher order interaction. Higher order interactions can be modeled using generalizations of graphs like hypergraphs. But in this particular talk, we'll be focusing on a data structure called a simplicial complex. So again, in social networks, if you think of a link prediction problem, an analogous problem that we discussed in the previous slide, what you basically have is a higher order link prediction problem where you would like to predict not necessarily if there's a link between two users, but if there is a higher order link. We will get into more details of this. A higher order link could be, for instance, not an edge, not a line segment, but a triangle, right? So that's one order higher, or it could be a tetrahedron or a polygon. So that could be higher order, but we'll be restricting ourselves to simplices, for example, line segments, triangles, and tetrahedrons in this talk. So similarly, you can also encounter data sets that are edge-based vector fields that appear on topologies, but these are, when you tessellate the manifold, the topology, you would restrict the flows on these edges. So if you want to predict a trajectory, for example, imagine you have you're monitoring currents in ocean, and then you put sensors on a buoy, and that would traverse a certain trajectory, right? So that could give you many trajectories, and based on those measurements, you would like to classify these trajectories to know more about the underlying physical phenomena. Or you would like to, if you are thinking about traffic flow, predicting what is the best route to take, given a sequence of nodes that you have visited on a known trajectory or an edge, you would like to predict which of these two nodes should I visit, which means that which is the next best edge that I need to traverse. So that's prediction problem. So in these cases, you would use a higher order model, the higher order data structure, and we would restrict to simplicial complexes. Similarly, for the problem that was the node level problem, which was graph classification, you could think of graph classification or a higher order graph classification by not just looking at a graph, but a click lifted graph, which means that you are basically transforming a graph that you have to a simplicial complex. So here you would see that these are all click lifted graphs seeing up to 4 vertex clicks. So that's the highest order of click that is available. But now the problem is the same, right? So it's a graph classification problem, but now I'm modeling the graph not just by looking at the interactions between vertices, but pair of vertices, but supra-pairwise or higher order interactions. But this is giving me a different view of the graph. And now I can think of solving the same graph classification problem, but by looking at a more complicated model that would derive information about these higher order structures that are present. So the other interesting application is the so-called simplicial closure prediction, where these are point clouds that would evolve over time and result in several simplicial complexes that are formed. So at each time, you have time-stamped simplices or simplicial complexes that are evolving over time, and you would like to predict whether at some time point whether there will be a closure or not. We'll again look at this application as we progress. So you have a sequence of simplices, or you could simply consider the last time instance, a time instance t minus 1, and you would like to predict whether there will be a closed triangle, right? So that is what a simplicial closure would mean. So here is an application where, again, this is related to bioinformatics, where you would have interactions between drugs and proteins. And at various instances, there are some closures that are formed, which would relate to the new compounds or being used for antibiotics or any other drugs, or if there is a new discovery of interactions as we progress. So this is, again, a higher order link prediction, but often referred to as a simplicial closure problem. So now, in order to solve these simplicial complex data set related tasks, we first have to understand what a simplicial complex is, of course. But then what we also need is a more general black box compared to the graph representation learning, which is the simplicial representation learning black box. So what exactly is a simplicial complex? A simplicial complex is basically, it has vertices, and then you have simplices of various orders. Zero order simplex would be a node. One simplex would be a line segment or an edge. A two simplex would be a triangle, and the three simplex would be a tetrahedron, and so on, right? So you can have like hexahedrons and so on. So you have a collection of simplices that form a simplicial complex. And what is peculiar about this simplicial complex is the so-called inclusion property, which means that a three simplex would also have a two simplex within it, right? So a two simplex will also have edges. Now, that is a very nice structure, and we can also represent this using matrices and tensors. We will see how to do that as we progress. But now, again, if we think what we did with graph representation learning, we would like to do something very similar with simplicial representation learning, which means that given the simplicial complex, so suppose I have some way to feed this mathematical object, that is the simplicial complex, to a computer through a matrix or a tensor, and I also have attributes that this matrix related to each of this simplex. A zero simplex has a matrix, which means that it is a nodal feature matrix. And then I have a matrix for one simplex. This is an edge feature matrix, and so on. So that is indicated by these vectors. Now we would like to not simply process all these matrices using a multi-layer perceptron by combining features, composing nonlinear functions, but you want to take the underlying simplicial complex into account, right? So that's what would give you a simplicial awareness, and that is what would give you the simplicial embeddings. Now, each of these underlying simplices, so a simplicial complex, you can restrict your study to a simplicial complex by only considering up to three order simplex or a two order simplex. For example, I limit my study only to a two simplex, a triangle, or you could consider all the underlying simplices up to the highest order pressing. So that's a design choice. But if you restrict yourself to a zero simplex, then it's easy to see that zero and one simplex, it's easy to see that you're only considering a graph, right? You're ignoring the higher order structures. So simplicial complex, you would also see, for example, triangles that are hollow triangles, which we don't consider. So that's we only consider closed triangles. That's the shade that you see here, right? So that's a two simplex is always a closed triangle. So that's basically another entity that captures the interaction between these three nodes. And here, what this means is that these three nodes put together, they don't interact, but there are pairwise interactions between the underlying pairs of nodes that you see here. So now we have to learn representations for each of this, which means that given this feature, it could be a low dimensional representation, but or it could be retaining the dimension of the representation. But in any case, I would like to learn representations that take into account the underlying structure, the simplicial complex structure. So it should be aware of the interactions that this triangle or the edge or the tetrahedron would explain. So there is an embedding space for each of the simplex. So in this example illustration, I restrict to a triangle. So that means that I get three representation spaces, embedding spaces. And this was what we saw here, what we saw before. But an embedding space of an edge now would also have representations for each of these edges that we see in the simplicial complex. And now again, if you want to do trajectory prediction, you would, depending on the node that you would query or the edge that you would query, you would use these representations to again run a downstream machine learning task. For example, if you would like to do a simplicial closure prediction to see if there is a triangle that is being formed, then you would look at the embedding space of the two simplex. And if there is a new instance, which basically means that you would query this triplet, then you would form a decoder that would give you whether there is a 0, 1 answer, whether there'll be a triangle that is formed or not, right? So that's basically the idea behind simplicial representation learning. So again, simplicial representation learning, there are algebraic ways to go from this data type to the representations in the vector space. But as far as this talk is concerned, I'll be limiting myself to simplicial neural network type models. So now, before getting into the graph neural network and simplicial neural network models, let me connect MLPs to CNNs and then establish the relation between graph neural nets. And in particular, also discuss how to make it simple and powerful. So now all of us are certainly well aware of this. So whenever you have a tabular data, there's no ordered relationship in the features that you get. So you have a data matrix where every row is a new example, new instance, and then you have as columns features. What you would do is you would combine the features. You linearly combine the features. You would do that for each of these examples with the same linear combiner. And what you would like to do is you would like to take an affine transformation of the feature by combining the features, right? So the examples are sitting as rows. So you would linearly combine this with a matrix W and B, and these are not known to us. So, and then you would take a linear affine transformation and then a nonlinear function, which is known as an activation function. So you would define this nonlinear function, and you would compose several such nonlinear functions to arrive at intermediate features. And each of this is what is going to define a layer of a neural network and of a multi-layer perceptron. And depending upon how many neurons you put in the hidden layers, that would define the size of this matrix, right? So you would have as many features, each of them would be combined with the dimension that you require. That is what would dictate the number of neurons in each of these hidden layers. So you get an embedding after a feature map after, say, n layers, and then you would set up a loss function depending on the task at hand to that would basically let you learn all these underlying parameters, which are W's and B's that are sitting inside each of these boxes. So that's an MLP. Now, if you have a data structure that is a bit more ordered, like an image, then you would require scalability, in the sense that if I feed in a 12 megapixel image, I cannot simply vectorize that image and then take a linear transformation of all those pixels, because that would basically blow up the size of the parameters. But you would also want to leverage the fact that there is some ordered relationship in data, which means that the nearby pixels are correlated. Hence, what you would do is you would do a raster scan where you would limit the number of filters or the number of parameters that you would use and reuse that parameter. You would share that parameter. So what you again get is very similar to what you had in the case of MLP, but this linear transformation is now a convolution or a cross correlation operation where the W compared to this is now a bit more structured, right? So it's a convolution operation. So again, you would take an affine transformation defined by this convolution operation. You get intermediate feature maps, and then you apply certain activation function. Maybe you would want to reduce, subsample the feature map. You use pooling, and then eventually you get the feature maps. Again, you set up a loss function to learn these underlying parameters. So here, clearly, the underlying domain is ordered. So you have a canonical representation or an ordering for the domain, and you would use this raster scan. Now, when we go to graphs, I told you before that there is no underlying domain that is ordered, so you can always come up with a canonical ordering, but I cannot canonical way you would represent the data, but there's no ordering. I cannot say that node 1 is greater than node 2 and so on. So to basically go further into the describing the math, I'll introduce some basic notation. So graph is an object with set of vertices. So in this case, you have about 9 vertices and edges. So it's a list which tells if there is a connection between node 1 and 2. And there is a data matrix. So n times d, n is the number of nodes. D is the initial dimension or the dimension of the initial feature map. So that is what is given to us. So there are many ways to represent this graph as a matrix. One such way is looking at the adjacency list, form an adjacency matrix, which basically puts a non-zero entry whenever there is an edge between two nodes. You can think of a non-zero being 1, or you can have a weighted adjacency matrix. You can think of other variants of this adjacency matrix, which could be a Laplacian matrix, a normalized Laplacian matrix, and so on. So there are many ways to represent a graph, but we have this matrix. So what is given to us is X and A, and we have to now process to get embeddings, representations of these initial features. So if you now see what's going on in the convolution operation, you have a parametric filter where the parameters are the combining coefficients, and you can visualize what was going on in the image, which is a regular grid or a discrete 2D lattice. What you would basically notice is that whenever you want to arrive at a certain feature map, you combine the pixel values or the features sitting on these grid points using some parameters. So in case this linear filter, so you would use certain set of parameters. So we can impose a canonical ordering in which I would like to sweep, do the scan, but a similar story does not hold for graphs because there is no notion of sliding. I cannot slide. So now how to proceed? So in order to do that, what was typically done in the past is to think of a non-parametric representation, and that is what we will also rely on to make the graph neural network models simple and scalable. So now taking from the 2D grid, which is also a graph, to a more arbitrary graph, which is not necessarily a 2D discrete grid. So you now have if you want to get a representation of a particular node, you can think of a non-parametric representation, which means that I simply drop this W. You simply combine the information that is available in your neighbors, which could be the initial features, and then you arrive at a new representation of a particular node. So that's a non-parametric representation. There is nothing to learn, right? There's simply you take a sum. But you can also parameterize this by taking weighted combinations and see how do we need to combine the information that is sitting in the neighboring nodes, right? So you can assign different weights, and there are many different ways to set up a parametric form. One simple way is like, okay, let's use the common weights for all. You could use different weights. Right? There are many notions of how to arrive at this parametric form. But what is interesting is this operation that we are combining information from one hop neighbors. This can be thought of as a linear operation where you're doing simply A times X, A being the adjacency matrix, and X being the features that are sitting. This would be, say, for one particular column of this X matrix, you're combining information from different hops. Now you do A square times X, you're basically going two walk length and combining information from two hop neighbors, right? So that's what you would do in a non-parametric form. But if you want to set up a parametric notion for this, what has been postulated is the well-known graph filters. Graph filters, you would basically combine information using different parameters which are designed or learned depending on the context. If you're in signal processing, you would design that, learn that with a certain response. If you're doing machine learning, you would learn these, again, set of parameters using a certain loss function depending on the task at hand. So you're basically combining information from different hops. You see A square, combining information from why restrict to one hop information like what we did? Why not take information from two hop? That might give you a better representation. So that's basically the idea here. So you have different parameters with which you combine. So A square, A power K. So these are integer powers of the adjacency matrix, which again is a linear transformation of your features, right? So that's what is known as a graph convolution, right? So we can represent this graph convolution, or now take this forward to the black box notation that we have, where we have a set of W's and B's. But now I would like to not simply process this X using a linear transformation that did not take into account any underlying structure or relationship between the rows of X. But now I would like to make use of the fact that the features that we collect are not any features, not just tabular data, but these are features that are indeed collected on an underlying graph. And we know that graph. That is the assumption. In case you don't know the graph, there are techniques where you could prune. You could start with a complete graph and refine the edges depending on the representations that you learn, or simply learn the graph given the data that is suitable for a particular task. But here we'll assume that we know the underlying graph. So again, now I'm replacing that convolution or the cross-correlation operation that we saw before with a graph convolution, which means that you're basically now getting features by linearly combining information that is sitting in the neighborhood and then taking a nonlinear transformation. So if you look at this, you are basically taking information at each layer from k-hop neighborhood. A simpler version of this is to simply say that I only combine information from one hop neighborhood. And then I do that many times so that as I progress, say, for example, at the end of the second box, I have information from my two hop neighborhood. So that is easy to visualize by simply ignoring the nonlinear activation function. So you get, say, multiplication with A and itself. So that becomes A square. So you have information from two hop anyway at the end of the second box. So you're basically combining information from the initial features, taking a linear transformation. So linear transformation along this feature dimension with some learnable matrix. Okay. So, and you have again a bias that you would do, and you would fix the activation function. So this is a way to sequentially aggregate information, sequentially aggregate neighborhood information to arrive at intermediate feature maps all the way to the final embeddings that you would like. And how would you learn these Ws? That again depends on the task at hand, right? So if you're doing, say, node classification, then you would have a certain loss function. If you're doing graph classification, then each of these node embeddings, you should basically transform those node embeddings to an embedding for a graph, and then you would use that in the loss function. So now a more abstract way of writing this graph neural network is through this notation where you're gathering information that is there in the one hop neighborhood of node V. And then you have an aggregation function. This aggregation function, I view that as an abstract function. You need not limit yourself to always adding, right? So a sum aggregator, it could be different aggregators that one can think of. This could be a parametric learnable function, or it could be a non-parametric function, right? And then you would have another function that would combine the self-embedding that is already there at the node, and then combine that with the information that is there in the neighborhood, and that would give you an update of the embedding at node V, right? So that's an abstract way of writing a sequential neighborhood aggregation. So now, depending on what functions we use for f and phi, you would get different variants, 100 different variants that are out there for graph neural nets, starting from GCNs to graph sage, GIN, graph isomorphism networks, and so on. This is a basic model of GNNs. But what is important to realize is that to get the feature at the k+1 layer, you need to do aggregation during training. So during backprop, you're training, you're doing many such aggregations. So at the outset, it might seem that this is simply a matrix vector multiplication, but what we realize is that depending on the size of the graph, this simple matrix vector multiplication that is sitting there is not that simple, right? So you're basically doing this for each epoch many times. And depending on how dense the graph is, this can be a non-trivial operation. And now the main goal of the graph-aware neural models is to basically solve that issue to arrive at some scalable neural models that is having some information about the graph, relying basically on the non-parametric representation to mainly arrive at constant training time and memory requirement, and also have some nice theoretical properties. So in particular, what we are interested in is if you look at some sample graphs that we see here, we want the neural models to have a constant training time, irrespective of how many edges are there in the graph. And if there are a large number of nodes, the increase in the complexity should not be exponential like what we see here, but that could be something controlled. So we are interested in simpler models, right? Simpler models that takes graph structure into account, but not just stop at that point, but also see if there are nice theoretical attributes to that. So towards that end, what we basically propose is instead of thinking of a sequential aggregation procedure, we can think of a parallel aggregation procedure where we pre-compute the features that are graph aware using some non-learnable transformation function. So one such simple function that one can think of is start with a feature matrix that is a feature that you have. Now you can also generate another set of features by taking a look at the one hop representation. So the simple non-parametric representation that I mentioned before, that is a times x. So you can go all the way up to a cube, a4, and depending on the how much smoothness you want, you can go up to say R being a hyperparameter that you would decide. But mostly from what we see from the experiments, you would like in the sequential graph neural network or sequential aggregation-based neural networks, you would require 3 layers at most. So you would also require aggregations that go up to 3 hop distance. So we pre-compute features. There's no learning happening, right? So there is no learning happening. Now, each of these features can be combined using some learnable functions that is driven by the task at hand. So there are some underlying parameters of these learnable functions, and you would learn the underlying parameters based on the task at hand. If it is graph classification, then that parameter would be different. And if it is node classification, those set of parameters are different. So you would have learnable functions that would basically combine. So instead of doing this aggregation many times, you basically do it one time beforehand. There is a pre-computation load that you will have to incur, but compared to the training time involved in the sequential aggregation, like what we saw before, this would be you're basically getting rid of the computation due to graph during the training process. So, and then you would get embeddings for a certain node, all the nodes, in fact, from these different neighborhood hops. And then you would again combine to arrive at a final node embedding. So again, an abstract way of representing this is with a non-learnable function, you would aggregate information from different, not just one hop neighbors, but different neighborhoods. And then you have learnable functions, right? So you have a non-parametric function here, and then a parametric function. You would learn the parameters. And then you would also have some kind of a pooling mechanism. It could be a learnable pooling or a non-learnable pooling, but to combine embeddings that each node would get. So we coined this as simple and parallel graph neural net, but also it is it is as powerful as the WL test, which is a kind of a best known mechanism for detecting or discriminating two graphs that are isomorphic. So if you look at the runtime complexity, we saw this graph. The main gain is that you would basically get rid of the dependence on the edge. So you still L and R are analogous, like it's the depth versus the width in the number of aggregations. So how to now understand the theoretical characteristics of such neural networks? So in order to do that, I'll quickly introduce what a WL test is. So given two graphs, you would like to discriminate these two graphs. So in case they are non-isomorphic, the idea is that the embeddings that you would get out of a graph representation learning box should be different for each of these nodes, the nodes in each of these graphs. And that's the idea. So what Weisfeller-Lehmann test does is it's an index refinement or a color refinement algorithm, which would start with some initial labels. And then depending upon the neighborhood, it would it would have a hashing function, which is injective, and arrive at new set of labels. So for example, in this case, you would start with labels being all ones for the two graphs under test. And then you would now aggregate information. So very similar to sequential aggregation. So you would see that the hashing should be done for this now, this multi-set having the triplet 1, 1, 1. So that would get a new color or a new index that is 3. You keep on repeating this procedure. And finally, this method would converge. And in this case, you would see that these two graphs are isomorphic. And if you count the frequencies, count the number of numbers here, there is basically the histogram would look the same. So you'd basically not, you can say that this is isomorphic, but typically this is used for distinguishing two non-isomorphic graphs. It could so happen, as I will show, that you could run this WL test on two non-isomorphic graphs, and you would reduce it to two canonical forms that are identical, right? So that means that there are cases where WL test would fail, and hence we require a higher order notion of a WL test, and that is the Simplicial Weisfeller-Lehmann test that I will introduce. But anyway, so for example, graph isomorphism network, which is again one of the specializations of this abstract notion, where you would basically pick certain functions to make sure that you mimic what is going on in the WL test, and that basically gives you a powerful neural network in terms of the discriminative power. That it would give you different embeddings if the graphs are non-isomorphic. And if the graphs are closed, you would require the embeddings also to be closed, right? That's the idea. So although this is predominantly used for classification, you could also use this for simply understanding the expressive power of the graph neural net model. So now going back to the spin model, this is the parallel isomorphism network. What we basically have is a nice theorem which says that the spin is also as powerful as the WL test, which means that it is going to generate embeddings that could distinguish two non-isomorphic graphs, provided that these functions that we pick here, G's and F's, are injective, right? So that's the catch. So if these functions are injective, then the embeddings that are generated by the parallel aggregation would be similar to that of the Weisfeller-Lehman test, and hence it is as powerful as the Weisfeller-Lehman test. So an example architecture is you pick MLPs, you would pick aggregation mechanisms that are injective, right? So that is the basic idea here. I would skip this, but go into the some experimental results related to graph classification. So what we see is that in terms of theory, we also have a powerful architecture. In terms of empirical evidence, what we see is that for most of the data sets, the architecture performs competitive. Although it is simpler, it is computationally nice, less expensive, it performs very good. So red is the first best, blue is the next best. And you would see that some of the sequential aggregation, which is the best thing to do, right? So you aggregate, you combine on the fly during training, right? So before you know how to combine, depending on what intermediate features are, that is actually the best thing to do, but that is computationally intensive. But now what we see is that the parallel architecture or the aggregation is as competitive as the sequential counterparts. So now, by the way, how much time do I have? About 10 minutes or so? Or?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the other application that one could think of is link prediction, where link prediction for computational pharmacology. This was something that we did during the pandemic, where the data set is the COVID pandemic, where the data set is a biological network where you have entities that are coming from different domains, diseases, drugs, genes, anatomies. And now the idea is that if there is a new disease, we would like to see if any of the drugs that are already approved can be repurposed. So which means that can we use the already approved drugs to treat or palliate a new disease. That essentially is a drug repurposing problem, which is nothing but a link prediction problem. So now if you are interested in interaction prediction between two drugs, then it's a link prediction problem in this lab where you're predicting interactions between two entities. So you could basically use the graph neural network, and we needed the scalable architecture basically because of the scale of the problem that you see here. So it's a large scale data. And these are some details, but the basic idea is that there are certain nodes that pop up as new instances, and then you would like to see if there is a potential link that one could establish. So here are the list of drugs that the model would predict, and you can now use these as a pre-screening pre-screened list to see if you want to further test, pass that through clinical trials and so on, right? So for that particular disease. So far, we were talking about graph representation learning. In the next 10 minutes or so, this is the generalization of the spin architecture, which you can already guess where the story is going towards. Now, we would like to have similar scalable architectures for simplicial representation learning. So in simplicial complexes, compared to the neighborhood, the usual neighborhood definition in graph, now you have four types of neighborhoods. So in particular, there are upper and lower adjacent neighborhoods. The upper adjacent neighborhoods are basically the ones that you would see in a graph. But you also see a lower adjacent neighborhood because you have an edge, and edge could have a lower adjacent neighbor, but node, there's nothing lower than a node, right? So now you're talking about higher order entities. There are four different types of neighborhoods that one could think of. For instance, these edges that we see here are boundary adjacent to the triangle that is there, and the triangle is now a co-boundary adjacent, right? So that's the definition of a neighborhood. So there are two neighborhoods that one could think of. But now there could also be a lower and an upper adjacent neighborhood. So for example, if you look at this tetrahedron, there are two triangles that are part of this tetrahedron. So those are upper adjacent, and there is an edge common between the triangle. So then that means that these two triangles are also lower adjacent, right? So there are different neighborhoods that one could think of, four particular neighborhoods. And depending on this neighborhood, one could also construct a matrix representation for the neighborhoods that's captured by this incidence matrix, where the ijth entry of a particular simplicial complex, a K simplex, which would be a zero simplex, is a node. One simplex would be the incidence matrix of an edge. And you would get a non-zero entry if a certain simplex is incident on the other simplex, right? So that's how you would construct this boundary matrix. And you would use incidence matrix, and these incidence matrices can further be used to compute and construct the so-called adjacency matrices, very similar to how we construct an adjacency matrix or a Laplacian from an incidence matrix. You could also construct one for a lower, one for an upper. So these are square matrices, as you can imagine. And however, the boundary and the co-boundaries are rectangular matrices, right? So now you can already see the challenge of doing an aggregation like what we were doing. If you want to think of integer powers, you could think of integer powers of these square matrices, but not of these. So that's the main challenge, how to pre-compute. So now an abstract representation of a simplicial neural network model. So if you're considering a particular simplex, there is an initial feature of that simplex. You would want to pass that through a black box to get a representation, a final representation of that simplex. And that would you could use that for a downstream task. So now a sequential neighborhood aggregation analog of GNNs is what we see here, where you're basically getting features different from different neighborhoods and then combining them here, right? So this could be a learnable function like what we had with the sequential GNNs, but now you have four types of neighborhoods. Now, depending upon which neighborhoods you want to consider, if you only restrict yourself to upper and lower neighborhoods, ignore the boundary and the co-boundary, you would get simplicial convolution neural networks. If you consider all these use a particular function, then you would get this message passing simplicial neural networks. But nonetheless, the aggregation is again done during training, during backprop, as what we saw with GNNs. So MPSN, again, you're specifying a particular aggregation function where the aggregation now is based on the adjacency matrix. So you would have initial feature or feature at the kth layer of a kth simplex. You would combine with a linear transformation, and then the adjacency matrix. So you do that for upper, lower, boundary, co-boundary, and so on. And also the self-embedding. So this could be an identity matrix, or if you want to ignore the self-embedding, you would simply set this to 0, and then you have a combining function, right? So that's the psi function to get to the features of the K simplex, and you would have many such matrices for each of the underlying simplex. So that's an example of a more general simplicial neural network representation. So this problem is even more complicated and computationally intensive when we look at the runtime for an example data set where the underlying simplices can go up to hexahedron to 7 simplex or triangles. The goal is again the same. We would like to have a scalable, simplicial-aware neural network architecture with a constant training and a memory time. So depending upon the simplex, the number of simplices there, number of triangles there, we would want to maintain a constant runtime, but we also want that to be probably powerful, right? So probably powerful in terms of the Weisfeiler-Lehman, but the higher order Weisfeiler-Lehman, which we call a simplicial Weisfeiler-Lehman test. So as I mentioned, since you have now non-square matrices, the aggregation is slightly complicated, but the idea is the same. So you would like to get information from, say, T-hop neighborhoods to arrive at the representation, a pre-computed representation of a certain simplex at a certain hop, right? So it depends on all the previous T hops. So now you can, if you want to visualize this generic function using matrix multiplications, you can basically compute this using a sequential operation. But the point is, now you have features from all these different orders of simplices, and you would like to combine information from these different neighborhoods to arrive at the pre-computed feature at the T branch. So you have many such branches, and there is these are non-learnable functions, right? It's a non-parametric representation, and now you would like to combine the information that you derive from these pre-computed features. So compared to simply using the tabular data that is available, at this point you will have features that know about the underlying simplicial complex. So you would get a feature of a case simplex at Tth level. So you can basically gather many such hops, which will basically give you information about T hop, T plus one hop, and so on, but from all these neighborhoods. And then the idea is the same. You would use all these pre-computed features and use a learnable transformation that will have underlying parameters that you would learn depending on the task at hand. And you would do that n plus one times for all the n plus one simplices that are underlying the simplicial complex. So you would get a representation of this. So now, again, as it's not difficult to see that if you restrict yourself to, say, k is equal to 0, then this is basically spin. But what we now have is a generalization of the spin architecture, which we call as simplicial-aware neural networks, to get embeddings that are not limited to nodes, but also you're not limiting yourself to aggregations to only aggregating upper adjacent neighborhood information, right? So you're aggregating from 4 neighborhoods. As a consequence, these models are more expressive than typical GNN models because you're basically gathering information from different neighborhoods. So now to compare the power of the simplicial neural network models, what we have is a simplicial Weisfeller-Lehmann test where the hashing function remains the same, but now the update rule will again take information from these 4 neighborhoods that I mentioned. And what we can see is that these are 2 graphs that are not isomorphic, right? So a click-lifted graph. It's a graph. I want to test the discriminate whether these 2 graphs are isomorphic or not. If I run the Weisfeller-Lehmann test, which basically considers the interactions in the upper adjacent neighbors, which means that the first hop neighborhood information and sequentially updates the labels, the count that you get, if you look at the histogram after the WL test converges, the count would be the same. So basically what the WL test would declare these 2 graphs as isomorphic graphs. But it is easy to see that these 2 graphs are not isomorphic. On the other hand, now if I do click lifting, click up to 3 order here, and run this SWL test, I would see that this is indeed able to distinguish the 2 graphs under test. So it's the same graph, but I'm doing a little transformation on this, that is click lifting, and then that allows me to run the SWL test. So what we can see is that SWL is more powerful than the 1WL test, which only considers pairwise interactions. And you can also show that the SNN models, the simplicial neural network models, are as powerful. You can basically construct simplicial neural network models that are as powerful, and also show that some of the models are not as powerful. For example, if you only consider the upper and the lower neighborhood, it is simply as powerful as WL, but it cannot beat in terms of the power of the SWL test. So you require indeed the aggregations from these boundary and co-boundary. So these are some interesting things that one could show. But now coming back to our architecture where we are aggregating, we have 2 theorems. One is that one can show that the parallel aggregation architecture that we have for simplicial neural networks are strictly more powerful than the WL test under conditions where we choose these non-parametric and parametric functions to be injective. The proofs are there in the paper if you're interested, but the basic idea is that if you run this SANN on node level tasks or graph level tasks, you basically get expressive models at the cost of combining information from the neighborhoods, but we have now a simpler way of how to combine information. And the other theorem is the SAN architecture is as powerful as the SWL test. So it's more powerful than the 1WL and is as powerful as the SWL test under the same set of conditions that now you require these functions to be injective. So that's basically the theory part. Now, if you look at an example architecture, what you could think of is simply use the adjacency matrices that I introduced here. That would give you the features. You can sequentially pre-compute. You can go t plus 1, t plus 2, and so on up to t. You have all the pre-computed features. Then use a learnable transformation, for instance, an MLP, to arrive at intermediate features and then pull that to obtain final embedding for a case simplex, right? That's an example architecture, but you could indeed take any other functions that are injective as well. So two nice properties, which are also easy to demonstrate, is that if you pick these parametric functions to be odd, you can show that the function, the SAN architecture is orientation equivariant, and it is permutation equivariant as well, right? So these are required for some of the tasks that we have. So coming to numerical experiments, I would need a few more minutes to wrap up. So the trajectory prediction task is basically, as I said, to predict, given a sequence of paths, you would like to predict which is the next probable path. So you would like to predict which node that one should visit. And we see that what we see here in the two are the pre-computation time. So time required for aggregating the features, non-parametric way. And this is the runtime. So what we see that is the SAN is, of course, naturally computationally attractive, but the performance compared to state-of-the-art methods is also competitive. The red ones are the best ones. Blue is the second best, right? That's what we see. What is interesting is that some of the models like MPSN, one of the simplicial neural network models, for simplicial closure tasks where the data set is really huge, we cannot basically fit the data even to the memory before running it. So these are basically out of memory, hence no results can be obtained. But the SAN gives you results that are competitive, but with very computationally attractive pre-computation times as well as run times, right? So this is the run time. Here, we cannot even load that in the GPUs that are available, right? So this is on the same infrastructure. So if you have a better infrastructure, maybe you could load that, but I hope the idea is clear, right? So you're basically having a simpler architecture, which gives you results that are competitive. Again, for the graph classification task, you could again do click lifting and apply SNN models, including SAN. So we see that it performs better than the GNN models. If you compare the MPSN, this models are not too off. If you look at the mean, they'll be different. But if you look at the standard deviation, there is a significant statistical overlap that one could see. So these are giving you competitive models, which are probably powerful, computationally very attractive. So with that, I would like to conclude. So what we have seen is a class of simple GNN models, SNN models. GNNs are specializations of SNNs where it has two stages. One is a non-parametric feature aggregation, non-learnable. And then you would have a learnable transformation of that depending on the task at hand. So we also can show that these models which look simple, naturally computationally attractive, are also powerful in terms of the Simplicial Weisfeld-Lehmann test. And empirical evidence suggests that you should all use this model. So with that, I would like to conclude this talk. So these are the reference papers, the codes are available. That's the university where I am currently in. So if you want to visit, happy to host you. So with that, I would conclude this talk. I guess I took a few more minutes than what was given to me, but I hope you enjoyed it. Happy to take any questions if there are.
Thank you, Sandeep, for this very instructive talk. There are some questions on the chat also. I don't know if you see them as well. First
Yeah.
question was about, can the neighborhood be a single node? Okay, I guess then you need only two nodes, I guess, in the graph or something. But yeah.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. I guess in exceptional cases, this can be the case. Then also a question by Said Sanei, whether the adjacency matrices are still considered zeros and ones. So this was related to the last part, I think.
No, it need not be. I mean, one could consider a weighted adjacency, a weights for the boundary maps. Of course, that's an interesting question. What weights would you choose? But the assumption is you know that boundary map, you know the adjacency matrices. It need not be zero ones. It need not be the adjacencies, but you can also think of variants that you derive from the adjacencies.
And then can you combine also link prediction and node classification under graph segmentation, which is a more well-known term since 88?
So indeed, like it's a multitask problem now. You would have two different losses, but again, you would use the same set of embeddings that you would compute, but then the parameters that you would, I guess, learn not just for a single task, but for a multitask. Right? So, or you would go in a self-supervised or a task agnostic way to learn the parameters, and that could be used for a whole bunch of tasks, right? Not necessarily for one task, but either self-supervised or semi-supervised, you could use the models that we saw today.
Okay. Then there's a question by Faisefala, whether the purpose of aggregation is to achieve some kind of weight sharing. And then how is the extension to 3D neighborhoods?
Okay, so purpose of aggregation is basically to gather information that is available in the neighborhoods, right? So somehow extract local information that is there in the graph and that is explained by the graph. So that is why you would combine information within the neighborhoods, but not also limit to one hop neighbor. You would want to go to two hop. Extension to 3D neighborhoods, that's not very clear to me because nodes, okay, if you have 3D coordinates associated to each node, you don't limit yourself to 3 or 2D. You could, if basically the graph is a tessellation of a surface, a 3D surface, indeed you could do.
Whether the diamond has no dimension, basically.
Yeah, that's
and the weight sharing, I mean, or the aggregation is kind of to join, to merge kind of the feature information with the graph information, right? Somehow.
right. Yeah. So yeah, to incorporate the graph structure.
And then there's a question also whether, you have the simplicial neural nets, whether they are filter based or spectral based. Yeah, I guess you can implement both, right?
Yeah. So the generic model that I showed, one can also write this as a convolution filter, but typically in simplicial convolutions, we only limit ourselves to the two neighbors, L and U, the upper and the lower adjacent. So that is what would give the so-called Hode's Laplacian. And then you can think of parameters with which you can aggregate information, right? So that's possible, but maybe one could also think of a generic filter that also takes the boundary and the co-boundary. But yeah, that's possible, yes. So that's like a filter, indeed like a filter, but what is different is like you're looking at one hop or one filters of one order, right? So you can combine this again with say a kth order filter that is possible, but this is like a one.
So you don't go to the spectral domain basically here, right?
Yes,
So
yeah.
you do it in the filter for in the vertex.
In the vertex simplex domain.
Yeah. Okay, and Sergio has a question on whether you can add some comments about learning not only the functions but also the topology in the
Yes. So yeah, it's actually a very interesting question. What one could do is maybe it's easier to explain using a graph. So just forget about the colors here. So if you're thinking of a sequential aggregation now, you have a data set, but you know that there is an underlying graph, and you don't know how to form that graph. So of course, one way is to do topology inference. But if you want to use a neural network, which would learn a graph based on the task at hand, what one could do is, if you look at, at this point, so what we are basically getting is features. So at this point, you're basically having a graph, which could be a fully connected graph. I don't know what graph to use, but then I'm getting embeddings, the initial embeddings, which are refined. I get some embeddings here. Now you could basically do a simple correlation test or like a similarity check between the features that I get. Now you would set a threshold and refine the graph, right? So you would basically try to taper out the links that would lead to embeddings that are not correlated. So if you keep on doing that, what we have seen is that you would get very interesting graphs, which would basically learn topology starting from a fully connected graph, which means that at each layer, you're using a different graph. So this is what we have seen in graphs, but I'm sure one could easily extend this also for learning topologies for simplicial complexes and various simplicities, right? So there are two directions. One is the algebraic optimization way of learning topologies, but also one could use these embeddings similar to how we would do link prediction, right? That's like kind of learning a link, but now start with a fully connected graph and prune the graph as you progress. So that's one way that comes to my mind if you want to learn simplices and simplicity complexes. But again, that can become very complex if you think of simplicities of many orders, right? So that's.
Okay, and then how does pre-computation, I guess these aggregations, not increase memory usage compared to a GNN?
So basically, you would so what you would do is you would basically pre-compute and store it once, right? You don't have to load this computation into the GPU every time you're training, right? So that's the basic understanding, right? So you reduce a lot of these computations that you would do on a GPU instead of you could basically store that in CPU and then load it once. So you don't have to do it on the fly.
Okay, any other questions for Sandeep? You can also unmute if you want to just do it online.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I have one question. So these pre-computed features can be like handcrafted features, you mean?
Yeah, so you could indeed handcraft if you don't care about the power, if you don't want to prove the expressivity in terms of the Weiss filler. If you want to prove, you have to use any function, any non-parametric function that is injective. That is what we prescribe. But the handcraft should somehow, the handcrafting should somehow incorporate the graph structure, right? That's the basic requirement. And you could use injective functions if you require expressivity also.
Okay. And the question that I asked about weight sharing, because the image that in the left side you are showing, it's actually a normal, for example, convolutional neural network, which applies this weight sharing ideas. So I wanted to know what is the advantage of this aggregation in comparison to the normal neural networks. because they also learn the neighborhood information within each kernel of the, for example, convolutional filter.
Yeah, so convolution filter, you would, so this is what you would do in a convolution, right? So you would basically assume that the underlying graph is a 2D grid, right? So that's what you would assume for convolution kernels, right? So this is a convolution operation. And what you're basically doing is like when you visit different patches, you're using the same set of weights. So in a way, if you look at graph filters, they're also doing weight sharing, where this version of the graph filter, you see that it's the same set of weights that you would use for all the nodes. Of course, you can think of more complicated parametric representations, but you are sharing for a particular hop, you're sharing that weight for all the nodes in the graph. And you would again use a different weight if you want to combine information from the second hop. So there is a weight sharing if you want to use, say, a GCN variant, right? That's the analog, but yeah.
And in your setting, you don't do that weight sharing, right?
Yeah. So yeah, if you use this, then you don't do weight sharing, right? So you would use some kind of a linear transformation where you would combine features. Yeah.
No, this is still weight sharing, right? So in this setting, right?
Yeah, so you would say for one hop, you would use the same matrix, right? It's not a
Right,
scale.
but it's for the same nodes, the same weights, right?
Right, yeah. Mhm.
But you don't do that in your structure that you show later on. You don't have that, right? That weight sharing. I mean, you have a function.
Yeah, we have a non-parametric
Yeah.
function that does not have weights at all. But then later on, for each of these hops, we would indeed have different weights.
Right.
But you could also use you could tie the weights of these networks as well.
But the G's have no node index, so they are the same for all nodes, right? The G function.
So, yes.
So there's also
So you
sharing
would
the function, the learnable functions, at least they're shared over the nodes, right?
Yeah, so here you would basically feed in the number of rows for all these functions would be n, and then you are transforming like the MLP. You are transforming the features that you get, right? You're combining the features. So you would
But the
use
MLP is over the nodes then, or the G0 is over the
these are the features.
Over the features of that node, right? So it's node specific because the ZV that comes out is node specific, right? So here in the picture.
No, but you would have like, so I only take one vector, but you would get transform features of all the nodes, right? That would be, so if you look at
Yeah, but the
so
function is applied
here,
to.
the rows are the number of nodes, right? You would always preserve this dimension. And then the combination is happening over the features. So the rows should always be the same, right? So y1 would also have the same number of rows as x.
Yeah,
So
okay.
except that now what we are feeding is ax, a square x to such a neural network.
Yeah, okay. But I'm just wanting to know what is the entry of the G function is the size is the number of features, right? Not the number of nodes, right? Your structure this I understand.
Yeah.
This we
Yeah,
understand.
I mean, just look at this and instead of x, you would replace a times x. So that means that you would apply the same set of weights for all the nodes.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So here for each example, I would apply the same set of weights, right? So that's what this means.
Yeah, that I understand. But so you're just saying that your structure is the same, but you use a nonlinear combination of functions, or in your structure that you show later on. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the G function, right? So you can imagine this entire thing as a G function.
So the G for every branch you have a G.
Yes.
Okay,
So, what I was
here
telling
it's
in terms of
only one branch here. Yeah, basically.
weight sharing is that you could indeed use the same set of W1s, W2s for all the branches, right? So that's possible.
Okay. Maybe one final question in the chat about graph compression. So would that in graph classification, do you think that graph compression, so you learn compressed graph conditioned on feature info would lead to interesting results?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're looking at graph classification, this is a compression that you would do, right? So you would basically compress this entire graph into one label, right? That's the best way of thinking of compression. But with representation learning, so if you have a graph with n nodes, you would like to represent that with a vector of d nodes. Again, if it is for a semi-supervised task, which is graph classification, that's a compression. But you can also, as I said, do this in a self-supervised learning fashion where it is again a graph compression, right? So, but representation, that's the generic answer for any representation learning task, right? Not necessarily the architecture that I presented.
Okay, I think we can, considering the time, we can wrap up here. So thanks a lot, Sandeep.
Thank you. Thanks all for attending, and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we'll see each other next month. I think I don't remember the date exact. Maybe the 20th or the 21st of February, I think.
Maybe the 17th.
Or okay, yeah. Anyway, you will get
21st.
Or 21st. Yeah, you will receive announcements anyway. So
Mhm.
okay, see you all